The fluorescent lights above Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Martinez flickered with the rhythm of a dying heartbeat as she stared at the stack of discharge papers scattered across her desk. Blood, dried and brown like autumn leaves, stained the corner of Form DD-214, and her hands trembled as she tried to piece together what remained of Corporal Jensen's final documentation. The paper had been retrieved from Humvee 3 days after the IED blast that turned Highway 1 into a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams. Outside the reinforced windows of the administrative building at Forward Operating Base Valor, the off-gone sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and shadow. Sarah had been filing papers for 8 months now, each document a fragment of someone's story, enlistments filled with hope, commendations earned in blood, and discharge papers that sometimes arrived before the soldier did. Her fingers moved with practiced precision across the keyboard, entering data that would outlive the men and women it represented. But today, something felt different. Today, the weight of each keystroke seemed to echo through her chest like a funeral dirge. The door to her small office burst open without ceremony, bringing with it the scent of cordite and desert sand. Commander Jake Reaper Morrison stood in the doorway, his sealed trident catching the harsh light. His uniform was still dusty from a mission she wasn't cleared to know about, and his eyes held that distant look she'd learned to recognize in the operators who came through her office, the look of someone who'd seen too much and carried too little hope of forgetting it. "Martinez?" His voice was gravelly, worn smooth by years of shouted orders and whispered prayers. "I need you to process something for me." Sarah straightened in her chair, her spine finding that military posture that had been drilled into her at boot camp 3 years ago. "Of course, sir. What documentation do you need processed?" Commander Morrison stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded final. He was a legend around the FOB, a man who'd earned his call sign by bringing death to America's enemies with surgical precision. The other SEALs spoke of him in hushed tones, sharing stories of impossible missions completed and teammates brought home against all odds. But standing in her cramped office, surrounded by filing cabinets and the detritus of military bureaucracy, he looked almost fragile. "It's not what you think, Martinez." His hand moved to the custom M4 carbine slung across his chest. The weapon was unlike any she'd seen, modified with precision optics and personal engravings that caught the light like silver thread. "This isn't about papers, Martinez. This is about something bigger." Sarah's fingers hovered over her keyboard, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand. If this isn't documentation, then perhaps you need to speak with—" "You ever wonder why they call it just filing papers, Martinez?" Morrison interrupted, his eyes scanning the walls of her office. Every surface was covered with charts, regulations, and photographs, images of the soldiers whose final chapters she'd helped write. There was Private Chen, who died saving a village from insurgents, Sergeant Williams, whose Purple Heart citation she'd typed through tears, Lieutenant Brooks, whose final letter home she'd processed alongside his posthumous Silver Star recommendation. "I processed the documentation," Sarah replied, though something in his tone suggested the question went deeper than her job description. "That's what I do, sir. I process the documentation that ensures these soldiers' service is properly recorded and their families receive the benefits they've earned." Morrison moved closer to her desk, his boots silent on the concrete floor despite their size. "You ever read what you type, Martinez? Really read it?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Of course she read it. Every word, every commendation, every final goodbye. She'd memorized the citation format, could recite the standard language for Valor Awards in her sleep. But Morrison's question suggested something else entirely, something that made her stomach clench with sudden understanding. "Sir, I read every document that crosses my desk. It's important work." "Important," Morrison repeated, the word hanging in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. You know what's important, Martinez? The fact that 3 days ago, I watched a 22-year-old kid from Iowa take shrapnel meant for me. You know what he said when the medic was trying to stop the bleeding? He said, "Make sure the paperwork's right, sir. Make sure they spell my mom's name correctly on the notification." The kid was dying, Martinez, and he was worried about paperwork. The fluorescent light above flickered again, casting Morrison's face in alternating shadow and harsh white light. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for him to continue, but sensing that his next words would change something fundamental about her understanding of her role in this place. "That kid's name was Tommy Kowalski," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "From Cedar Falls, Iowa. Star quarterback in high school, joined the Army to pay for college, wanted to be a teacher. You processed his enlistment paperwork 18 months ago." Sarah's hands flew to her keyboard, fingers dancing across the keys with muscle memory. She pulled up the file. Kowalski, Thomas James. The photograph showed a young man with bright eyes and a smile that suggested he believed in happy endings. She remembered him now, remembered the way he'd lingered in her office asking questions about education benefits and deployment schedules. "He made it through surgery," Morrison said, watching her face as recognition dawned. "He's being medevaced to Landstuhl tomorrow, but his story, the real story, isn't going to be in any report you'll ever file." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer would complicate her carefully ordered world. Morrison unslung his M4, holding it with the reverence of a man cradling something sacred. The weapon was clearly personal. The stock bore initials carved deep into the polymer, and the upper receiver had been engraved with coordinates that Sarah suspected marked places where impossible things had been accomplished. "This rifle has been with me for 6 deployments. It's taken lives and saved lives. It's been blessed by chaplains and cursed by enemy fighters. It's part of me, Martinez, as much as any organ in my body." Sarah stared at the weapon, trying to understand why a SEAL commander was showing her his personal firearm in what should have been a routine administrative meeting. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of helicopters landing at the LZ and the ever-present hum of generators keeping their little outpost of American military might operational. "That rifle, he wanted you to have it," Morrison finally said. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She actually pushed back from her desk, her chair rolling on its casters until it hit the wall behind her. "Sir, I can't possibly." "This isn't a request, Martinez. It's an order, wrapped in a request to make it easier for both of us to live with." "But sir, You're just filing papers. I know. That's what everyone thinks. That's what you think. But what if I told you that those papers you file are the only truth that survives this place? What if I told you that the way you record these stories determines whether these soldiers are remembered as heroes or statistics?" Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates grinding against each other deep beneath the surface of her consciousness. She looked at Morrison's rifle, then at the stacks of documentation surrounding her, then back at his face. His eyes held secrets she wasn't sure she was ready to learn. "There's something happening here, Martinez. Something that goes deeper than the usual fog of war. Soldiers are dying, and their stories aren't making it into the official record. Good soldiers. Heroes who deserved better than bureaucratic burial." "What kind of something?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer would complicate her carefully ordered world. Morrison placed his rifle carefully on her desk, the metal warm from his body heat and the desert sun, the kind that requires someone with access to all the paperwork to piece together the truth, the kind that requires someone who can see patterns across different units, different time frames, different classifications of documents. Sarah stared at the weapon, its custom modifications catching the light like promises and threats in equal measure. She could see her reflection distorted in the scope lens, her face stretched and uncertain. "Sir, if there's wrongdoing, there are proper channels. Inspector General, Criminal Investigation Command. Already tried, Morrison cut her off. Funny thing about proper channels, Martinez, they tend to dry up when the people who control the water don't want it to flow. The implications of his words settled over her like dust from a distant explosion. Sarah had always believed in the system. The military bureaucracy that she served might be slow and sometimes frustrating, but it was fundamentally just. The idea that someone might be actively subverting that system, using it as a weapon against the very soldiers it was meant to protect, shook something fundamental in her worldview. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she whispered. Morrison leaned forward, his hands flat on her desk among the scattered papers. "I'm asking you to do what you've always done, Martinez. File papers, process documentation, keep records. But I'm asking you to do it with your eyes open this time." "And the rifle?" "Insurance," Morrison said simply. "This place has a way of making inconvenient people disappear. Documentation gets lost, assignments get changed, accidents happen. But if something happens to me, that rifle will remind you that this conversation took place. It'll remind you that a SEAL commander believed strongly enough in what you do to trust you with his most precious possession." Sarah reached out tentatively, her fingertips barely brushing the rifle's stock. The polymer was warm and textured, real in a way that made everything else in her office seem suddenly insubstantial. "Why me, sir? Why not someone with actual investigative authority?" Morrison straightened up, and for a moment his professional mask slipped, revealing exhaustion and something that looked like grief. "Because you're the one person on this FOB who actually sees these soldiers as people, instead of just names on a list. I've watched you, Martinez. I've seen you cry over casualty reports that other people process like grocery receipts. I've seen you stay late to make sure a Purple Heart citation was perfect because you knew it would matter to someone's mother." The truth of his words hit her like a revelation. She did care, perhaps more than was healthy for someone in her position. Each document that crossed her desk represented a human life, a story that deserved to be told accurately and with dignity. But Morrison was asking her to do more than just care. He was asking her to act on that caring, to risk everything she'd built in service of a truth she couldn't yet fully comprehend. "Sir, if I agree to this, and I'm not saying I am, what exactly would I be looking for?" Morrison leaned forward, his hands flat on her desk among the scattered papers. "Patterns, Martinez. Inconsistencies. Soldiers who die under suspicious circumstances but whose deaths get attributed to enemy action. Heroic actions that get downgraded or omitted entirely from official reports. Resources that get diverted from missions that subsequently fail catastrophically." Sarah felt her world tilting on its axis. "You're talking about conspiracy, sir. Multiple levels of cover-up involving—" "I'm talking about the systematic murder of American soldiers by someone with enough authority to manipulate the official record. And I'm talking about the only person on this base with access to enough documentation to prove it." The silence that followed his words was heavy with implication and fear. Sarah stared at the rifle on her desk, understanding that accepting it would mean accepting a burden that might destroy her life. But the alternative, continuing to just file papers while soldiers died for reasons that had nothing to do with serving their country, suddenly seemed impossible. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked finally. Morrison checked his watch, a gesture so mundane it seemed obscene in the context of their conversation. "My team ships out at 0600 tomorrow. If something happens to me on this mission, you'll need to make your own decision about what to do with what I've told you. And if nothing happens to you, then you and I are going to have a lot more conversations about the difference between filing papers and preserving truth."
Morrison moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. "Martinez, there's something else you should know. Tommy Kowalski, the kid from Iowa, he wasn't supposed to be on that patrol. Someone changed his assignment at the last minute, put him in a vehicle that intelligence knew would be targeted." The words hit Sarah like shrapnel, sharp and burning. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that sometimes soldiers die because someone wants them dead, and the paperwork gets filed in such a way that no one ever asks why." With those words, Morrison opened the door and stepped back into the harsh desert sunlight, leaving Sarah alone with his rifle and the terrible weight of possibility. She sat in the sudden quiet, staring at the weapon and trying to process everything he'd told her. The stack of papers on her desk, discharge forms, commendations, casualty reports, suddenly looked different, as if each document might be hiding secrets she'd been trained not to see. Her computer screen still showed Tommy Kowalski's file, his young face smiling at her from a photograph that had been taken in a world where the worst thing that could happen was failing a quiz or missing curfew. Now he was lying in a hospital bed in Germany, his body shattered by an explosion that Morrison suggested might have been orchestrated by someone wearing the same uniform they all served. Sarah picked up Morrison's rifle, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to fit naturally against her shoulder. She'd qualified with the standard M16 in basic training, but this weapon was something else entirely. A precision instrument designed for a kind of warfare she'd only heard about in whispered conversations between special operations personnel. The engraving on the upper receiver caught the light, and she leaned closer to read the coordinates etched into the metal. 34 degrees, 32 minutes north, 69 degrees, 8 minutes east. Afghanistan, certainly, but she couldn't place the specific location. Below the coordinates in smaller text were initials, JM and SH, brothers always. SH. Sarah wondered who that might be. Another SEAL, perhaps, or maybe someone Morrison had lost along the way. The rifle carried history in its modifications and scars, stories that would never make it into any official report she might file. A knock at her office door made her jump, and she quickly set the rifle back on her desk, covering it partially with a stack of personnel files. "Come in." Sergeant First Class Mike Hendricks entered, his expression curious as he took in the scene. Sarah's flushed face, the partially concealed weapon, the general aura of disruption that seemed to hover in the office air like smoke from a distant fire. "Everything okay, Martinez? Saw Commander Morrison leaving your office and you look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah forced a smile, her mind racing through possible explanations for Morrison's visit and the rifle now hidden under her paperwork. "Just processing some documentation for his team. You know how it is with special operations. Everything's classified and complicated." Hendricks nodded, accepting the explanation with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned not to ask too many questions about SEAL business. "Fair enough. Listen, I've got a batch of Purple Heart citations that need to be processed by end of business today. Hire wants them expedited for some reason." He handed her a manila folder thick with documents, and Sarah accepted it with hands that she hoped weren't visibly shaking. "Of course, Sergeant. I'll get right on it." After Hendricks left, Sarah opened the folder and began reading through the citations. The names were familiar, soldiers she'd processed documentation for over the past few months. Men and women who'd been wounded in various actions across the region. But as she read through the details of their injuries and the circumstances surrounding their Purple Heart recommendations, patterns began to emerge. 3 of the 5 soldiers had been wounded in IED attacks while on patrols they hadn't originally been assigned to. 2 others had sustained injuries during mortar attacks on convoys that had taken alternate routes at the last minute due to intelligence updates. All 5 incidents had occurred in locations that intelligence should have identified as high risk, yet the patrols had proceeded anyway. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning struggling against the Afghan heat. Morrison's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes soldiers die because someone wants them dead, and the paperwork gets filed in such a way that no one ever asks why. She pulled up her computer's database and began cross-referencing the Purple Heart recipients with other documentation she'd processed. Assignment changes, intelligence reports, mission briefings, all of it normally filed away without thought, but now each document seemed to carry additional weight and meaning. The pattern became clearer with each search. Soldiers who'd been asking questions about missing supplies or suspicious orders found themselves assigned to increasingly dangerous missions. Personnel who'd reported concerns about operational security or unusual command decisions suddenly experienced routine transfers to more hazardous positions. And throughout it all, the paperwork told a different story, one of routine combat operations, normal casualties of war, and heroic soldiers doing their duty in service of their country. The truth, if Morrison was right, lay not in any single document, but in the spaces between them, in the patterns that emerged only when someone looked at the whole picture with suspicious eyes. Sarah glanced at Morrison's rifle, still partially hidden under her paperwork, and realized that accepting it would mean accepting responsibility for seeing those patterns and acting on them. It would mean becoming something more than just a clerk who processed documentation. It would mean becoming a guardian of truth in a place where truth had become a casualty of war. The fluorescent light flickered again, and Sarah made her decision. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through Sarah's dreams at 05:30, dragging her back to consciousness with the efficiency of a combat medic treating a sucking chest wound. She lay in her narrow bunk for a moment, staring at the plywood ceiling of her containerized housing unit, trying to reconcile the woman who'd gone to sleep with the woman who'd agreed to investigate potential conspiracy and murder among her fellow soldiers. Morrison's M4 carbine rested in a locked footlocker beside her bed, wrapped in an old PT uniform like a secret too dangerous to leave exposed. She'd spent 3 hours the night before researching the coordinates engraved on its receiver, discovering they marked a village in Helmand province where a Taliban commander had been eliminated in a surgical strike that saved 32 Afghan civilians and an entire Marine platoon. The operation had never been officially acknowledged, but Sarah had found references to it buried in classified after-action reports that crossed her desk months ago. Her morning routine had become a sacred ritual over the past 8 months, a series of precise movements that helped maintain the illusion of normalcy in a place where normalcy was as rare as rain. She dressed in her ACUs with mechanical precision, each motion practiced and automatic. Desert tan boots laced exactly the same way every morning, unit patches positioned with military precision, hair pulled back in a regulation bun that would survive whatever the day might throw at her. The walk to the dining facility took her past the motor pool, where mechanics were already working on vehicles that had returned from night patrols bearing fresh scars from roadside bombs and small arms fire. The smell of diesel fuel and cordite hung in the morning air, like incense in a church dedicated to the god of controlled violence. Breakfast was the same powdered eggs and mystery meat that had sustained American soldiers since immemorial. But Sarah found herself studying the faces around her with new eyes. The young private from Arkansas who always sat alone, reading letters from home. Was he just homesick, or was there something else behind the fear in his eyes? The staff sergeant who'd started coming to chow with bandages on his knuckles. Were those the result of PT accidents, or was he preparing for a different kind of fight? "You look like hell, Martinez." Sarah looked up from her untouched breakfast to find Captain Lisa Chen settling into the chair across from her. Chen was the FOB's intelligence officer, a Harvard graduate who chose in military service over Wall Street and had never seemed to regret the decision. She was also the closest thing Sarah had to a friend in this desolate place. "Thanks for the confidence boost," Sarah replied, attempting levity but hearing the strain in her own voice. Chen's dark eyes studied Sarah with the intensity she usually reserved for analyzing enemy movement patterns. "Seriously, you look like you've seen a ghost, or maybe like you've become one." The comment hit closer to home than Chen could have known. Sarah felt like she was becoming something different, transforming from a clerk who processed paperwork into something more dangerous and far less certain. "Just didn't sleep well. The generators were running loud last night." "The generators run loud every night," Chen observed. "You've been here long enough to sleep through artillery bombardments. What's really going on?" Sarah found herself at a crossroads of trust and secrecy. Chen was intelligence, trained to spot lies and inconsistencies,
but she was also someone who might have access to information that could either confirm or refute Morrison's allegations. The decision to share what she knew felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unable to see the bottom, but knowing that stepping forward would change everything. "Can I ask you something hypothetical?" Sarah said carefully. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Hypothetical questions from you usually mean someone's in trouble. What's the scenario?" "If someone wanted to eliminate specific soldiers without it looking intentional, how would they do it?" The question hung between them like smoke from a distant explosion. Chen's expressions shifted from casual concern to focused attention, her intelligence training taking over. "That's a hell of a hypothetical, Martinez. Why are you asking?" "Because I think someone might be doing exactly that." Chen set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "That's a serious accusation. What makes you think—" "Patterns," Sarah interrupted. "Soldiers getting reassigned to dangerous missions right after they report problems or ask inconvenient questions. IED attacks that happen exactly where intelligence said they would happen, but patrols go anyway. Casualty reports that don't quite match the tactical situation reports." "You've been cross-referencing classified documents?" Sarah realized she'd revealed more than she intended, but Chen's tone suggested curiosity rather than accusation. "It's not intentional cross-referencing. It's just, when you process enough paperwork, you start to see patterns that don't make sense." Chen leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Sarah, if you're right about this, you're talking about something that goes way beyond simple corruption. You're talking about systematic murder using the fog of war as cover." "I know what I'm talking about." "Do you?" Chen's question carried weight beyond its simple words. "Because if you're right, then you're also talking about an investigation that could get you killed. And if you're wrong, you're talking about destroying your career and possibly compromising legitimate operations." The brutal honesty of Chen's assessment hit Sarah like cold water. She had been so focused on the moral imperative of investigating Morrison's claims that she hadn't fully considered the personal cost of pursuing the truth. But looking at Chen's concerned face, she realized that backing down now would mean living with the knowledge that soldiers might be dying while she did nothing to stop it.
"What would you do?" Sarah asked. Chen was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers to questions that had no easy solutions. "I'd want to be very, very sure before I did anything. But if I was sure—" She looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes. "I'd remember that I took an oath to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic." The phrase "domestic enemies" hung in the air between them like an unspoken confession. Sarah realized that Chen might have suspected something was wrong but lacked the access or authority to investigate. The intelligence officer dealt with threats from outside the wire: Taliban fighters, IED emplacers, foreign agents seeking to infiltrate or eliminate American personnel. But threats from within were outside her purview, requiring different kinds of evidence and different channels of investigation. If someone were conducting such an investigation, what kind of evidence would they need? Documentary proof of intent, communications showing premeditation, financial records indicating bribery or coercion, multiple witness statements from credible sources. Basically, enough evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that deaths weren't accidental or combat-related. Sarah felt her heart sink. The evidence Morrison wanted her to find might be enough to establish patterns, but proving intent would require access to communications and financial records that were far beyond her clearance level. She was a clerk, not an investigator, and the gap between those roles suddenly seemed unbridgeably vast. "That sounds like more than one person could accomplish alone," Sarah said carefully. Chen's smile was grim, but not without warmth. "A good thing you're not alone, then." The offer of help was implicit, but unmistakable. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since Morrison's visit the previous day.
Having an ally, especially one with Chen's training and access, transformed the investigation from a suicide mission into something that might actually succeed. "There's something else," Sarah said, making another decision to trust. "Commander Morrison gave me his personal rifle yesterday, said it was insurance in case something happened to him." Chen's eyes widened slightly. "Morrison gave you his M4? The one he's carried for 6 deployments? You know about it?" "Every operator on this FOB knows about that rifle. It's practically legendary. Morrison turning it over to anyone would be like a knight giving away his sword." She paused, clearly processing the implications. He must be very certain about what he suspects and very worried about what might happen to him. The weight of Morrison's trust settled over Sarah like armor, protective but heavy, offering security at the cost of mobility and innocence. She thought about the young woman who'd arrived at FOB Valor 8 months ago, excited about serving her country and convinced that military bureaucracy, however frustrating, was fundamentally just. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone naive and unprepared for the complexities of war and the darkness that could flourish when good people looked the other way. "I keep thinking about the families," Sarah said. "All these soldiers we've lost, their parents, their wives, their kids. They think their loved ones died serving something bigger than themselves. But if Morrison's right, then they died because someone with power and authority decided they were expendable, and their families will never know the truth." The injustice of it burned in Sarah's chest like acid. She joined the military partly because she believed in service and sacrifice, but also because she believed in truth and accountability. The idea that someone might be perverting those ideals, using the military's own systems against its own people, violated everything she thought she understood about honor and duty. "When do we start?" Sarah asked.
Chen checked her watch, a gesture that seemed to carry ritual significance. "Morrison's team shipped out at 0600 this morning. They're due back in 72 hours, assuming everything goes according to plan. And if it doesn't, then we'll know that whatever he suspected was serious enough to kill him for." The stark reality of Chen's words settled over them like dust from a distant explosion. Sarah realized that she was no longer just processing documentation about other people's dangers. She was now actively courting danger herself, stepping into the crosshairs of forces she didn't fully understand. But as she looked across the dining facility at the young soldiers eating their breakfast and preparing for another day of trying to survive in a place that wanted them dead, Sarah knew she couldn't back down. These were her people, her brothers and sisters in arms, and if someone was hunting them from within their own ranks, she had a duty to stop it. "There's something I need to show you," Sarah said, making the final commitment to trust Chen completely. "Morrison's rifle, it has coordinates engraved on it. I researched them last night, and I think they might be connected to whatever he discovered." Chen nodded, her expression shifting into the focused intensity Sarah had seen her use when analyzing threat assessments. "After chow, we'll go to your office. I want to see everything you found so far." As they finished their breakfast in companionable silence, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in the past 18 hours. Yesterday, she'd been a clerk with a routine job and predictable problems. Today, she was part of a conspiracy to uncover conspiracy, allied with an intelligence officer in a mission that could either save lives or end her own. The walk back to her office took them past the aid station, where medics were treating a soldier who'd stepped on a mine during a routine patrol. His left leg was gone below the knee, and he was conscious enough to be asking about his battle buddies and whether his unit had completed their mission. Sarah watched the medics work with professional competence, their faces masks of controlled urgency, and wondered how many of the casualties they treated were truly accidental. Her office felt different now, transformed from a bureaucratic workspace into something that felt more like a command center.
Morrison's rifle, still hidden in her footlocker, represented both a sacred trust and a constant reminder of the stakes involved. Chen studied the space with professional interest, noting the filing systems and security measures with the eye of someone trained to assess operational vulnerabilities. "Show me what you found," Chen said, settling into a chair beside Sarah's desk. Sarah pulled up the Purple Heart citations from the previous day, walking Chen through the patterns she'd identified. As she spoke, she watched Chen's expression shift from skeptical attention to genuine alarm. The intelligence officer's training made her quick to spot the operational inconsistencies that Sarah had identified through intuition and careful documentation review. "These assignment changes," Chen said, pointing to a series of personnel transfers Sarah had highlighted. "They all came through command channels, but they bypassed normal operational security protocols. Someone with significant authority issued these orders directly without going through the usual chain of coordination." Sarah felt a chill of confirmation. Someone with access to personnel records, intelligence briefings, and operational planning. Someone who knew exactly where to send these soldiers to maximize the chances they'd be killed or wounded. Chen's voice carried the weight of professional certainty. "This isn't random, Sarah. This is systematic elimination disguised as combat casualties." The truth of Morrison's allegations settled over them like a shroud. Sarah stared at her computer screen, at the names and faces of soldiers who died or been wounded in what she now understood were carefully orchestrated attacks. Each document represented someone's child, someone's spouse, someone's future that had been sacrificed to serve an agenda she couldn't yet comprehend. "The question now," Chen said quietly, "is what we're going to do about it."
The next morning brought news that hit FOB Valor like incoming artillery. Morrison's team had missed their scheduled check-in, and their last known position was a valley in Helmand province where Taliban activity had reportedly intensified overnight. Sarah felt the news like a physical blow, her hands trembling as she processed the initial missing-in-action paperwork that would eventually become either rescue documentation or casualty reports. Colonel Marcus Webb, the FOB's commanding officer, called an all-hands briefing at 0800. Sarah found herself studying his face as he delivered updates about the missing SEAL team, looking for signs of genuine concern versus calculated performance. Webb was a career officer, 48 years old, with the kind of weathered competence that came from 3 decades of military service. His record was exemplary. Bronze Star, Combat Infantry Badge, multiple deployment ribbons that spoke of a soldier who'd earned his authority through blood and sacrifice. Commander Morrison's team failed to report at their scheduled checkpoint, Webb announced to the assembled personnel. "We're treating this as a tactical situation, not a casualty event. Search and rescue operations are already underway, and we expect to re-establish contact within the next 12 hours. Sarah caught Chen's eye across the briefing room and saw her own skepticism reflected in the intelligence officer's expression. Morrison had been operating in hostile territory for 15 years. Missing a single radio check might be tactical necessity, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that his disappearance was connected to the investigation he'd asked her to conduct. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her office to find a stack of new documentation waiting on her desk. Personnel transfer orders, intelligence briefings, casualty reports from other FOBs, the usual flow of bureaucratic paperwork that kept the bureaucratic machinery functioning. But as she began processing the documents, patterns emerged that made her blood run cold. 3 soldiers who'd reported equipment theft from their unit's armory had been transferred to forward patrol bases within the past week. 2 Marines who'd questioned discrepancies in supply manifests had been assigned to convoy duty along routes that intelligence classified as high risk, high reward. A Navy communications specialist who'd reported irregular message traffic had been transferred to a joint operation with Afghan National Army forces, a notoriously dangerous assignment where American personnel were often left exposed to insider attacks. Each transfer order bore the appropriate signatures and authorization codes, but Sarah was beginning to recognize the subtle signs of manipulation that Chen had taught her to identify. Orders that bypassed normal review processes, assignments that violated standard rotation protocols, and documentation that was technically correct but operationally suspicious. Her computer chimed with an incoming message, and she opened it to find a routine request for personnel files from the Inspector General's office at Bagram Airfield. The message looked standard: proper formatting, correct authorization codes, even the right electronic signature, but something about it made her hesitate before complying. She picked up her secure phone and dialed the IG's office directly. "Inspector General, Staff Sergeant Williams speaking. This is Petty Officer Martinez at FOB Valor. I received a request for personnel files that's supposed to be from your office, but I wanted to verify before releasing classified documentation." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Martinez, we didn't send any requests to your location today. Can you read me the authorization code on that message?" Sarah read the code, and Williams confirmed what she'd suspected. "That's not one of our codes, Martinez. That's a fraudulent request. Do not release any files, and report this immediately to your security officer."
Sarah hung up the phone with hands that were no longer steady. Someone was actively trying to obtain personnel files using forged authorization, files that would include the soldiers she'd been tracking, the ones who'd been systematically placed in harm's way. The timing, coming just as Morrison's team had gone missing, couldn't be coincidental. Chen appeared in her doorway as if summoned by telepathy. "We need to talk. Now." They moved to a storage room behind Sarah's office, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and office supplies that offered more privacy than any other location on the FOB. Chen carried a laptop and a folder thick with documents, her expression grim with the weight of discovery. "I've been analyzing the communication logs from the past 6 months, Chen said without preamble. Morrison was right. There's a pattern of interference that goes way beyond normal operational security measures. Sarah felt her stomach clench. What kind of interference? Mission parameters being changed at the last minute through unofficial channels, intelligence reports being modified after initial distribution, communication blackouts that coincide with casualty events. Chen opened her laptop, showing Sarah a spreadsheet that tracked dozens of incidents across multiple time periods. Someone with high-level access has been systematically manipulating operations to increase casualty rates among specific personnel. The scope of what Chen was describing hit Sarah like a physical blow. This wasn't just about individual soldiers being targeted. It was about systematic manipulation of military operations to serve an agenda that had nothing to do with mission success or force protection. How many soldiers are we talking about? 43 confirmed casualties over the past 8 months. All of them had 2 things in common. They'd reported irregularities in supply chains, personnel assignments, or operational security, and they were subsequently assigned to missions that resulted in death or severe injury. Sarah stared at the numbers on Chen's screen, each statistic representing someone she'd processed paperwork for, someone whose final documentation she'd typed with trembling fingers. 43 soldiers, 43 families who think their loved ones died serving their country. They did die serving their country, Chen said quietly. They just didn't die fighting foreign enemies. The distinction felt important, but cold comfort to the families who would never know that their sons and daughters had been murdered by someone wearing the same uniform they died defending. "There's more," Chen continued. "I've been tracking the supply discrepancies that several of these soldiers reported before their deaths. Equipment shortages, ammunition that doesn't match requisition records, vehicle maintenance schedules that don't correspond to actual mechanical conditions." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone has been systematically stripping resources from forward operating bases and selling them on the black market. And when soldiers started noticing and reporting the thefts, they got transferred to situations where they couldn't report anything anymore." The scope of the conspiracy expanded in Sarah's mind like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Equipment theft,
black market sales, systematic murder of witnesses. They were looking at corruption that reached into the highest levels of command structure and potentially involved millions of dollars in stolen military resources. "Do we have any idea who's behind this?" Sarah asked. Chen's expression darkened. "That's where things get really complicated. The manipulation of orders and intelligence reports requires access to systems that are restricted to field-grade officers."
Officers and above. We're not talking about some rogue sergeant skimming from supply shipments. We're talking about colonels, maybe even generals. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The idea that senior officers, people she'd been trained to respect and obey without question, might be actively murdering their own soldiers violated every assumption she'd held about military service and chain of command. "Colonel Webb?" she whispered. "I don't know yet, but he'd have the access and authority to do everything we've documented." Chen closed her laptop, the gesture somehow final and ominous. "Sarah, if we're right about this, then we're not just investigating crime, we're investigating treason. And people who commit treason at this level don't hesitate to eliminate threats." The weight of their situation settled over Sarah like a lead blanket. She thought about Morrison, missing somewhere in the Afghan mountains, and wondered if his disappearance was coincidence or the next step in a cover-up that had already cost 43 lives. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. "We document everything we can as quickly as we can, and we prepare for the possibility that we might not survive long enough to see justice done." Chen's blunt assessment should have been terrifying, but Sarah found it oddly liberating. The fear was still there, but it was accompanied by a clarity of purpose that she hadn't felt since joining the military. She had found something worth risking everything for: the truth about soldiers who died trying to do the right thing. They spent the next 3 hours in the storage room, cross-referencing personnel records with mission reports, tracking the flow of equipment and supplies, and building a comprehensive picture of systematic corruption and murder that reached into the highest levels of military command. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming, a pattern of manipulation that could only be explained by deliberate intent to eliminate witnesses and maximize profit from stolen resources. At 1400 hours, an urgent message came through Sarah's computer terminal. Morrison's team had been found. 3 of the 4 SEALs were dead, killed in what the initial report described as a Taliban ambush. Morrison himself was missing, presumed captured or killed, with his body not yet recovered. Sarah stared at the casualty report, her hands shaking as she processed the documentation that would officially record Morrison's probable death. The timing felt too convenient, the circumstances too clean. Morrison had suspected systematic murder within his own command structure, and now he was conveniently eliminated before he could present evidence or testimony. "They killed him," she whispered. Chen read over her shoulder, her face pale with anger and grief. "Or they arranged for someone else to kill him. Either way, we just lost our primary witness and the one person with enough credibility to make accusations stick." Sarah thought about Morrison's rifle, still hidden in her footlocker, and understood that it had become more than just insurance. It was now evidence of a murdered soldier's final attempt to expose the truth. The encrypted coordinates on its receiver, the initials of a fallen brother, the modifications that spoke of countless missions completed in service of ideals that someone had perverted for personal gain. "We have to find a way to get this information to someone who can act on it," Sarah said. "Who?" Chen's question carried the weight of institutional skepticism. "Our chain of command is compromised. The Inspector General's office might be infiltrated. Even the FBI or CID investigators could be blocked by people with enough authority and connections." Sarah felt despair creeping into her resolve, but then she remembered something Morrison had said during their conversation, something about proper channels drying up when the people who control the water don't want it to flow. But water could find other paths, could carve new channels when the old ones were blocked.
"Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him enter.
Tell me everything. Rodriguez stumbled into her room, his hands shaking as he pulled a flash drive from his pocket. I was doing routine maintenance on communication equipment when I found encrypted files hidden in system directories, files that show orders being transmitted through unofficial channels, payments being made to offshore accounts, lists of soldiers marked for what the files call operational reassignment. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Do you have copies of these files? Everything's on here, Rodriguez said, holding up the flash drive. Equipment manifest showing massive theft of weapons and supplies, financial records showing millions of dollars being diverted to private accounts, and worst of all, a list of 47 soldiers who've been targeted for elimination, with progress reports on their deaths. 47, Sarah whispered. We only identified 43. 4 more are scheduled for operational reassignment within the next week, Rodriguez said. Including you, Martinez. Your name's on the list. The flash drive felt like a live grenade in Sarah's trembling hands as she inserted it into her computer. Rodriguez sat beside her, his young face etched with the kind of terror that comes from discovering that the people you trust with your life are actively planning your death. The files loaded with agonizing slowness, each megabyte revealing new layers of conspiracy that reached far beyond anything Sarah and Chen had imagined. The first document was a financial spreadsheet titled Operational Resource Reallocation, a euphemism that barely disguised what was clearly a detailed accounting of stolen military equipment worth over $18 million. Weapons, ammunition, vehicles, communications equipment, even medical supplies had been systematically diverted from their intended destinations and sold to the highest bidders on the black market. Jesus Christ, Sarah whispered, scrolling through pages of transaction records. They're selling weapons to the same insurgents who are using them to kill American soldiers. Rodriguez nodded grimly. It gets worse. Look at the communication logs. Sarah opened the next file and found herself staring at encrypted message traffic that had been routed through civilian networks to avoid military monitoring. The messages were brief and clinical, discussing problem personnel and operational solutions with the detached efficiency of businessmen planning a corporate restructuring. Subject: Package delivery confirmation from Anvil 6 to Serpent 3. Operation cleanup Phase 7. Confirm elimination of Package 23 to 27 per schedule. Package 28, Morrison J, required additional resources, but disposal is confirmed. Package 29, Martinez S, flagged for priority processing due to access concerns. Recommend immediate reassignment to Theater K for terminal resolution. Sarah stared at the message, her own name standing out like a target painted in blood. Morrison's death wasn't an ambush or operational casualty. It was a carefully planned execution, carried out by someone with access to his mission parameters and the authority to arrange his elimination. There are hundreds of these messages, Rodriguez said. They've been systematically identifying soldiers who might threaten their operation and arranging their deaths. They call it package disposal, like they're talking about taking out the trash. Sarah scrolled through more files, finding detailed dossiers on each soldier who'd been targeted. The files contained personal information, service records, and psychological profiles that suggested someone had been carefully studying their victims before arranging their elimination. Morrison's file was particularly detailed, noting his exceptional investigative instincts and dangerous tendency to pursue unauthorized inquiries. Her own file made her stomach clench with visceral fear. Martinez, Sarah Elena, PO2, USN, Administrative Specialist, FOB Valor, THRK. Threat level, high. Access to documentation, pattern recognition capabilities. Psychological profile, idealistic, justice-oriented, potential whistleblower. Recommended action, immediate reassignment to high-casualty environment, HCE. Timeline, 72 hours maximum. Notes,
Subject has access to comprehensive personnel records and demonstrated ability to identify operational inconsistencies. Elimination required before subject can compile actionable intelligence.
What about the media? Sarah asked. Chin's eyebrows rose. You're talking about leaking classified information to journalists. That's a federal crime, Sarah. Court-martial, federal prison, complete destruction of your life and career. As opposed to letting more soldiers die while we try to find someone in authority who isn't compromised? The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah realized that they'd reached a point where all choices led through dangerous territory, where doing the right thing required breaking laws and violating oaths that had once seemed sacred and inviolate. "There's a reporter," Chin said slowly, "Jessica Palmer from the Washington Post. She's done investigative work on military contracting and overseas operations. She might be willing to look at what we found." "How do we contact her without being detected?" Chin smiled grimly. "Very carefully, and with the understanding that once we make that call, there's no going back. We'll be committed to seeing this through to the end, whatever that might look like." Sarah thought about the soldiers whose documentation she'd processed over the past 8 months, about Tommy Kowalski lying in a hospital bed in Germany, about Morrison's team killed in an ambush that might have been orchestrated by their own command structure. The choice between personal safety and justice for the dead seemed obvious, even if the consequences were terrifying. "Make the call," Sarah said. That evening, as the sun set over the Afghan mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Sarah of muzzle flashes and explosions, she sat in her containerized housing unit and held Morrison's rifle. The weapon felt heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of 43 dead soldiers and the knowledge that seeking justice for them might require the ultimate sacrifice. She thought about her parents back in San Antonio, about the life she'd planned to build after her military service, about all the dreams and possibilities that she might be sacrificing in pursuit of truth. But she also thought about the families of the dead soldiers, about the parents and spouses and children who deserved to know that their loved ones had died as heroes, not as convenient casualties in someone else's profit scheme. The rifle's engravings caught the last light of day, coordinates of a place where impossible things had been accomplished, initials of brothers who'd promised to watch each other's backs. Morrison had kept faith with those promises until someone with power and authority decided he was too dangerous to live. Now it was Sarah's turn to keep faith, to honor the promise implicit in accepting Morrison's rifle and the burden of truth it represented. She might be just a clerk who filed papers, but those papers were the only record that would survive this place, the only truth that would outlast the lies and cover-ups and carefully orchestrated murders. As darkness fell over FOB Valor, Sarah Martinez made peace with the possibility that she might not survive long enough to see justice done. But she also made a promise to the 43 soldiers whose stories she carried. Their truth would be told, no matter the cost. The war for their memory was just beginning. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and Sarah quickly secured Morrison's rifle before answering. She found Corporal Danny Rodriguez standing outside, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "Martinez, I need to talk to someone I can trust. I found something I'm not supposed to know about, and I think it's going to get me killed." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water. Another soldier, another witness, another target for whoever was systematically eliminating threats to their operation. She looked into Rodriguez's frightened eyes and realized that the war for truth was about to claim another casualty, unless she could find a way to protect him. "They've been watching me," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They know exactly what I've been doing." "They've been watching all of us," Rodriguez replied. "Anyone who might notice what they're doing, anyone who might ask questions or report irregularities. Look at this." He showed her another file,
a comprehensive surveillance report on FOB personnel that included detailed behavioral assessments and threat rankings. Soldiers who demonstrated curiosity, integrity, or independent thinking were flagged as potential security risks. Those who showed willingness to follow orders without question were marked as assets and given preferred assignments away from operational zones. Sarah felt sick as she recognized the systematic nature of the surveillance. Every conversation, every question, every moment of doubt or concern had been cataloged and analyzed. The conspirators weren't just stealing equipment and eliminating witnesses. They were actively studying their victims, learning their weaknesses, and exploiting their dedication to duty as a weapon against them. "How did you find these files?" Sarah asked. Rodriguez's hand shook as he lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. "I was troubleshooting communication errors in the secure network when I noticed unusual traffic patterns, data being transmitted during scheduled maintenance windows when no official communication should have been occurring. I started digging deeper and found shadow directories hidden in system firmware." "Who else knows about this?" "Just you. I haven't told anyone else because I don't know who to trust. For all I know, my squad leader or platoon sergeant could be part of this thing." Sarah understood his paranoia. The conspiracy files revealed a network that included personnel at multiple levels of command structure, from senior NCOs to field-grade officers. Trust had become a luxury they couldn't afford when anyone might be compromised or complicit. Her secure phone rang, and Sarah answered it with growing dread. "Martinez, this is Colonel Webb. I need you to report to my office immediately for a personnel matter." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. Webb's name appeared in several of the encrypted messages, always in the context of operational oversight and asset management. She was being summoned by someone who might be directly responsible for planning her death. "Yes, sir. I'll be right there." She hung up the phone and looked at Rodriguez, seeing her own fear reflected in his young face. "That was Colonel Webb. He wants to see me." "Don't go," Rodriguez said urgently. "Sarah, if they're ready to move against you, if I don't go, they'll know we found something. At least this way we might buy some time to get this information to people who can act on it." Sarah copied the flash drive's contents to her own secure storage device, then added Chen's contact information and a brief message explaining what they'd discovered. "If something happens to me, make sure Captain Chen gets this. She'll know what to do with it." Rodriguez nodded, his face pale but determined. "What about the journalist Chen mentioned? Jessica Palmer?" "Chen will handle that. Right now, the most important thing is making sure this evidence survives even if we don't." Sarah stood up, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Morrison's rifle remained hidden in her footlocker, but she took comfort in knowing it was there, physical proof that a SEAL commander had trusted her with his most precious possession because he believed in her integrity and courage. The walk to Colonel Webb's office felt like a death march. Every soldier she passed might be compromised. Every officer might be part of the conspiracy that had already claimed 43 lives. The familiar sounds of FOB operations, generators humming, vehicles starting, soldiers conducting their daily routines, seemed muted and distant, as if she was already moving through a different world than the one she'd inhabited just hours before. Webb's office was located in the command building, a reinforced structure that served as the operational nerve center for FOB Valor. Sarah had been there dozens of times for routine administrative matters, but today the familiar space felt alien and threatening. The walls were covered with maps, unit citations, and photographs of Webb with various dignitaries and senior officers, images that now seemed like evidence of connections that might extend far beyond this remote outpost. "Sit down, Martinez," Webb said without looking up from a stack of documents on his desk. He was a large man, built like the infantry soldier he'd once been, with graying hair and the kind of weathered competence that came from 3 decades of military service. Under normal circumstances, Sarah respected him as a leader who cared about his soldiers and took his responsibilities seriously. Now, knowing what she knew about the systematic murder of those same soldiers, she had to struggle not to show the revulsion and fear that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. "Sir, you wanted to see me about a personnel matter?" Webb finally looked up, his eyes studying Sarah with an intensity that seemed to probe for signs of deception or hidden knowledge. "Yes, Martinez. I've received some concerning reports about your recent activities. Questions being asked, files being accessed outside normal protocols, patterns of behavior that suggest you might be operating beyond your assigned duties." Sarah felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean. I've been processing documentation according to standard procedures." "Have you?" Webb interrupted. "Because my understanding is that you've been conducting unauthorized cross-referencing of classified documents, asking questions about operational matters outside your clearance level, and generally behaving in ways that suggest you might be confused about your role here." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a distant explosion. Sarah realized that Webb was giving her an opportunity to back down, to claim ignorance and accept reassignment away from FOB Valor and the evidence she'd been collecting. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that might keep her alive. But looking at Webb's face, seeing the calculation behind his concern, Sarah understood that backing down wouldn't save her. She was already marked for elimination, already scheduled for terminal resolution, regardless of what she said or did in this office. "Sir, if there are concerns about my performance, perhaps we should involve the Inspector General's office. I'd welcome an official review of my activities." Webb's expression hardened slightly. "The IG's office is quite busy, Martinez. I'd prefer to handle this matter internally, through appropriate command channels." "Of course, sir. What exactly are you proposing?" "Immediate reassignment to Forward Operating Base Courage in Helmand Province. Your administrative skills are needed there for a special documentation project. You'd leave tonight on the supply convoy." Sarah felt her heart stop. FOB Courage had been overrun by Taliban forces 2 weeks ago, with all American personnel killed or captured. Webb was ordering her to travel to a location that no longer existed, escorted by people who would ensure she never arrived at any destination.
"Sir, I believe FOB Courage is currently—" "The situation at Courage has been resolved," Webb said firmly. "Intelligence reports may have been exaggerated. You're needed there for critical administrative support." Sarah stared at Webb, understanding that they'd moved beyond pretense into open threat. He knew she knew, and he was offering her a choice between accepting immediate execution disguised as a combat casualty or forcing him to arrange something more direct and messy. "I understand, sir. When do I need to be ready?" "The convoy leaves at 2100 hours. Be at the motor pool with your gear at 2045. Sarah stood up, her legs somehow supporting her despite feeling like water. "Yes, sir. I'll be there." As she turned to leave, Webb spoke again. "Martinez, I want you to know that I've always respected your dedication to duty. You're a good soldier who's found herself in an unfortunate situation. I hope you'll remember that there are different kinds of duty, and sometimes the most important duty is knowing when to stop asking questions." Sarah paused at the door, understanding that Webb was offering her one final chance to disappear quietly, to accept reassignment to a safe posting somewhere far from Afghanistan and the evidence of systematic murder. But she also understood that accepting would mean abandoning 43 dead soldiers and condemning future victims to the same fate. "Thank you for the advice, sir. I'll keep it in mind." She left Webb's office with a certain knowledge that she had less than 6 hours to live unless she could find a way to expose the conspiracy before the convoy departed for her execution. The weight of Morrison's trust, the evidence on Rodriguez's flash drive, and the faces of 43 dead soldiers pressed down on her like gravity from a collapsed star. But as she walked back toward her office, Sarah felt something unexpected, alongside the fear, a clarity of purpose that burned away doubt and hesitation. She'd found her war, her battlefield, her chance to serve something larger than herself. The enemy wore the same uniform she did, carried the same flag, and spoke the same oaths of honor and duty. But they'd forgotten what those oaths meant, and Sarah Martinez was going to remind them. Chen was waiting in Sarah's office when she returned, her face grim with the weight of new intelligence. "I intercepted communications about your reassignment to FOB Courage. Sarah, that base was overrun 2 weeks ago. They're sending you to die." "I know," Sarah replied, surprising Chen with her calm acceptance. Webb made that clear without actually saying it. "The question now is whether we can get this evidence to someone who can act on it before they eliminate us both." Rodriguez emerged from the storage room, his young face set with determination that hadn't been there an hour before. "I've been thinking about what you said, about making sure the evidence survives even if we don't. There might be a way to do that." Sarah looked at the two people who'd become her closest allies in this fight against institutional murder, feeling a surge of affection and respect that cut through her fear. Chen, with her Harvard education and intelligence training, could have chosen a safe career analyzing threats from a distance. Rodriguez, barely 22 years old, could have kept his head down and served his time without questioning the system that was trying to kill them all. Instead, they'd chosen to stand with her against forces that would destroy them without hesitation or remorse.
"What do you have in mind?" Sarah asked. Rodriguez pulled out his laptop and began typing with the focused intensity of someone working against an impossible deadline. "The communication system that I used to find the encrypted files? It's connected to multiple networks, including satellite uplinks that route through civilian internet providers. If I can hack into the command protocols, I might be able to broadcast our evidence through every military communication channel simultaneously." Chen's eyes widened with understanding. "A data bomb. Send everything to every command structure at once. Make it impossible for them to contain or suppress." "Exactly. But it would also be completely illegal and probably considered an act of terrorism or treason. Anyone involved would face life in prison at minimum." Sarah thought about the convoy scheduled to depart in 5 hours, about Webb's calculated offer of quiet execution, about 43 soldiers whose families would never know they died as heroes rather than casualties. The choice between breaking laws and allowing systematic murder to continue wasn't really a choice at all. "Do it," she said. Rodriguez nodded and began working with the desperate efficiency of someone racing against death. His fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing systems and bypassing security protocols with skills that suggested extensive training in electronic warfare. Sarah watched him work, amazed by the competence hidden behind his youthful appearance and quiet demeanor. "There's something else we need to consider," Chen said. "If we're going to expose this conspiracy, we need to make sure our evidence reaches people who can't be silenced or compromised. Military channels might be infiltrated at multiple levels." Sarah pulled out her secure phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never expected to use. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "Jessica Palmer, Washington Post." "Miss Palmer, this is Petty Officer Sarah Martinez calling from Afghanistan. I have evidence of systematic murder of American soldiers by their own command structure, and I need to get this information to someone who can ensure it reaches the public." There was a pause. Then Palmer's voice returned with the focused intensity of an investigative journalist sensing a major story. "Petty Officer Martinez, that's a serious allegation. What kind of evidence are we talking about?" "Financial records showing $18 million in stolen military equipment, communication logs detailing the planned elimination of soldiers who reported irregularities, surveillance files on American personnel marked for death, and a list of 47 soldiers who've been targeted for what the perpetrators call terminal resolution." Palmer's breath caught audibly. "Jesus, how do I know this is legitimate?" Sarah looked at Chen and Rodriguez, both working desperately to compile and transmit evidence that might cost them their lives. "Because in 4 hours, I'm scheduled to be eliminated for discovering it.
and because the SEAL commander who first identified this conspiracy was murdered 3 days ago to prevent him from exposing it. Where are you now? Are you safe? I'm at Forward Operating Base Valor, and no, I'm not safe. None of us are safe. The people responsible have the authority to arrange our deaths and make them look like combat casualties. Palmer's voice carried the weight of professional commitment. I need you to send me everything you have. Email, secure file transfer, whatever method you can access. My colleagues and I will begin verification immediately. Sarah felt a surge of hope that surprised her with its intensity. We're preparing to transmit everything through multiple channels. But Ms. Palmer, if something happens to us before we can complete the transmission, you need to know that this conspiracy reaches at least the colonel level and potentially higher. I understand. Petty Officer Martinez, I want you to know that your courage in coming forward may save countless lives. We're going to make sure this story gets told.
As Sarah ended the call, Rodriguez looked up from his laptop with sweat beading on his forehead. I'm in. I've got access to the satellite communication array, and I can push our files through every military network simultaneously. But once I initiate the transmission, they'll know exactly where it's coming from. We'll have maybe 10 minutes before they lock down the entire base. Chen checked her watch. That gives us 3 hours before your convoy departure. Enough time to transmit the evidence and try to find somewhere defensible to wait for rescue or reinforcement. Sarah thought about Morrison's rifle, still hidden in her footlocker, and made a decision that felt both inevitable and liberating. There's one more thing we need to do. If we're going to make our stand, we need to be properly equipped. She led them to her housing unit and retrieved Morrison's M4 carbine, holding it with the reverence it deserved. The weapon felt like a sacred trust, a connection to a warrior who died trying to protect his soldiers from enemies within their own ranks. Morrison gave this to me because he knew I might need it. He trusted me to honor what it represents, the duty to protect those who can't protect themselves, even if it means standing against people who share our uniform. Chen nodded, understanding the symbolic weight of the gesture. We'll need more than one rifle if they decide to resolve this situation with direct action. Rodriguez looked up from his laptop. The arms room is secured with electronic locks that run through the same network I'm accessing. I can open it remotely, but that will also trigger alarms that alert the entire command structure. Sarah felt pieces falling into place with the clarity of a well-executed military operation. Here's what we're going to do. Rodriguez, you transmit all the evidence simultaneously to military commands, media outlets, and government oversight agencies. Chen, you secure additional weapons and ammunition from the arms room. I'll contact every friendly personnel on base and warn them about what's happening. What about the convoy? Chen asked. Sarah's smile was grim but determined. I'm going to miss my ride. The next 3 hours passed with the desperate efficiency of a combat operation. Rodriguez transmitted terabytes of evidence through satellite networks, sending the complete files to dozens of recipients simultaneously. The transmission included financial records, communication logs, surveillance files, assassination lists, and detailed documentation of 47 confirmed murders disguised as combat casualties. Chen secured weapons and ammunition from the arms room, distributing equipment to the handful of personnel they'd identified as trustworthy. The group included Staff Sergeant Williams from the motor pool, who'd noticed discrepancies in vehicle maintenance records. Corporal Thompson from Communications, who'd reported irregular message traffic, and Lieutenant Brooks from Intelligence, who'd questioned mission parameters that seemed designed to maximize casualties. Sarah used the base communication system to contact friendly units at other FOBs, warning them about the conspiracy and urging them to review their own personnel assignments and casualty patterns. The responses ranged from skepticism to alarm, but several contacts confirmed they'd noticed similar irregularities at their own locations. As the 2100 convoy departure time approached, Sarah felt a strange calm settling over her. She'd done everything possible to ensure the evidence would survive and reach people with the authority to act on it. Whether she survived the next few hours was no longer the most important question. Webb's voice crackled over the base public address system at 20:55 hours. Petty Officer Martinez, report to the motor pool immediately for convoy departure. Sarah keyed her radio with calm precision. Colonel Webb, this is Petty Officer Martinez. I'm unable to comply with that order, sir.
The silence that followed her refusal stretched for nearly a minute. When Webb's voice returned, it carried the cold fury of someone whose carefully planned operation had been disrupted by unexpected resistance. "Martinez, you will report to the motor pool immediately, or you will be considered in violation of direct orders and subject to court-martial."
"Sir, I'm currently engaged in activities related to the systematic murder of American soldiers by members of their own command structure. I believe that takes priority over convoy schedules." The public address system went silent, but Sarah could hear the sound of vehicles starting throughout the base. Webb had apparently decided that subtle elimination was no longer an option. If she wouldn't cooperate with her own execution, he'd arranged something more direct and dramatic. Chen's voice came through Sarah's earpiece. "Multiple vehicles moving toward the admin building. Armed personnel, tactical formation. They're coming for us." Sarah looked out her office window and saw the lights of approaching vehicles cutting through the darkness. Webb had made his choice, abandoning any pretense of legitimacy in favor of overwhelming force. The conspiracy that had murdered 43 soldiers was about to add 4 more to its body count. But Rodriguez's transmission had already reached its destinations, carrying the evidence that would expose decades of systematic corruption and murder. Palmer and her colleagues at the Washington Post were already verifying the files, preparing stories that would shake the military establishment to its foundations. Sarah picked up Morrison's rifle and chambered a round with the practiced efficiency of a warrior preparing for battle. The weapon felt right in her hands, as if it had been waiting for this moment, when a clerk who'd spent her career filing papers would finally have the chance to write her own story. "This is Sarah Martinez," she said into her radio, broadcasting to every friendly personnel on base. "I'm a Navy petty officer who discovered evidence of systematic murder of American soldiers by corrupt officers within our own command structure. That evidence has been transmitted to media outlets and government agencies that will ensure the truth is revealed. If I don't survive the next few hours, remember that 43 soldiers died as heroes, not casualties. Remember that good people stood up to evil even when it cost them everything." The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the admin building as Webb's assault team prepared to eliminate the last witnesses to their crimes. Sarah felt Morrison's presence like a guardian spirit, his rifle steady in her hands and his courage flowing through her like electric current. She'd started this deployment as someone who just filed papers, but she was going to end it as something far more important. A soldier who'd kept faith with the oath to protect and defend, no matter the cost. The war for truth was about to reach its climax, and Sarah Martinez was ready to write the final chapter with Morrison's rifle and her own blood, if necessary. 6 months later, Washington, D.C. Jessica Palmer stood before the Senate Armed Services Committee, her hands steady as she held a thick folder containing the evidence that had shattered one of the most pervasive corruption scandals in modern military history. The hearing room was packed with reporters, military families, and government officials, all drawn by the story that had begun with a phone call from a terrified Navy clerk in a remote Afghan outpost. "Senators, the evidence we obtained from Petty Officer Martinez and her team documented the systematic murder of 47 American soldiers over an 18-month period. These soldiers weren't killed by enemy action. They were eliminated by their own command structure because they discovered evidence of massive equipment theft and black market sales totaling over $30 million. Senator Margaret Collins, the committee chairwoman, leaned forward with the gravity befitting someone reviewing evidence of treason within the military establishment. "Ms. Palmer, can you tell us about the current status of the personnel involved in this conspiracy?" Palmer consulted her notes, though she could have recited the information from memory. "Colonel Marcus Webb, the commanding officer of FOB Valor, died during the assault on the administrative building where Petty Officer Martinez and their team had barricaded themselves. 7 other conspirators, including 2 lieutenant colonels and a brigadier general, are currently facing court-martial proceedings for treason, murder, and conspiracy to commit murder."
The committee room fell silent as Palmer continued. However, the most important outcome of this investigation isn't the prosecution of the perpetrators. It's the institutional reforms that have been implemented to prevent similar conspiracies from developing in the future. Senator Collins nodded solemnly.
And what can you tell us about the personnel who exposed this conspiracy? Palmer's voice carried a note of profound respect. Petty Officer Second Class Sarah Martinez, Captain Lisa Chen, and Corporal Danny Rodriguez survived the assault on FOB Valor, though all three sustained significant injuries. They are currently recovering at Walter Reed Medical Center and have been recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor for their actions in exposing systematic murder within their own command structure. 2 years later, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Sarah Martinez stood at attention as the Secretary of Defense pinned the Congressional Medal of Honor to her uniform, the weight of the decoration somehow lighter than the burden she'd carried for so long. The ceremony was being held outdoors on a crisp autumn morning, with hundreds of military personnel and families in attendance to witness the recognition of 3 soldiers who'd risked everything to expose corruption within their own ranks. In the front row, she could see her parents, their faces shining with pride and relief that her daughter had not only survived her ordeal, but had been recognized as a hero. Beside them sat Tommy Kowalski, the young soldier from Iowa whose near death had first alerted Morrison to the conspiracy. He'd recovered from his injuries and returned to school, studying to become a teacher as he'd always planned, but he'd insisted on attending the ceremony to honor the people who'd ensured his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Chen and Rodriguez stood beside Sarah, their own medals catching the morning sunlight. Chen had been promoted to major and assigned to a new position developing protocols for detecting and preventing internal corruption within military commands. Rodriguez had been commissioned as a second lieutenant and was leading a cybersecurity team focused on protecting military communications from infiltration by hostile actors. The actions of these 3 individuals, the Secretary of Defense announced to the assembled crowd, represent the highest ideals of military service: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, dedication to truth over personal safety, and unwavering commitment to protecting their fellow soldiers from those who would exploit their trust and sacrifice. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself thinking about Morrison and the rifle he'd entrusted to her. The weapon had been returned to his family, along with a detailed account of how his courage and sacrifice had ultimately saved dozens of lives by exposing the conspiracy that had claimed so many of his fellow soldiers. 3 years later, University of Texas, San Antonio. Dr. Sarah Martinez stood before a lecture hall filled with graduate students studying military ethics and institutional accountability. Her transition from Navy clerk to academic had been unexpected but natural. Her experience exposing corruption within military command structures had given her unique insights into the challenges of maintaining integrity within large, hierarchical organizations. The most important lesson from the FOB Valor conspiracy isn't that corruption exists within military institutions. It's that ordinary people with access to information and the courage to act on their convictions can expose and defeat even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. A student in the front row raised her hand. "Professor Martinez, what advice would you give to someone who suspects wrongdoing within their organization but isn't sure how to proceed?" Sarah paused, thinking about a young woman who once believed that filing papers was just filing papers, who never imagined that her administrative duties would lead her into a life-and-death struggle against institutional murder. "Document everything," she said finally. "Trust your instincts. Find allies you can rely on. And remember that sometimes the most important service you can perform is refusing to be complicit in something you know is wrong, even when that refusal comes at personal cost." After class, Sarah walked across campus to her office, where she kept a framed photograph that had become her most treasured possession. It showed Morrison's SEAL team before their final mission, 4 warriors in full combat gear standing against the backdrop of the Afghan mountains.
Morrison stood in the center, his rifle slung across his chest, his face set with the quiet determination of someone who understood that serving his country might require sacrificing everything.
Below the photograph was a brass nameplate that read, "Commander Jake Morrison and team, warriors who died protecting the truth." Sarah had learned that the SH initials engraved on Morrison's rifle belonged to Sergeant First Class Samuel Harris, Morrison's longtime teammate who'd been killed in action 2 years before the conspiracy began. The coordinates marked the location where Harris had died, saving a village from Taliban fighters, making the ultimate sacrifice to protect innocent civilians. Morrison had carried those memories into his investigation of the conspiracy, driven by the knowledge that soldiers like Harris deserved better than to have their sacrifice dishonored by corruption and murder within their own ranks. 5 years later, Arlington National Cemetery. The annual memorial service for the 47 soldiers killed in the FOB Valor conspiracy had grown from a small gathering of families to a national event attended by hundreds of people. Sarah stood with Chen and Rodriguez before the memorial wall, reading the names of soldiers whose stories she'd helped preserve through her documentation and investigation. Tommy Kowalski approached, now a high school teacher and coach who spoke regularly about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. "Professor Martinez, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did, not just for exposing the conspiracy, but for making sure these soldiers are remembered as heroes instead of statistics." Sarah nodded, her eyes moving across the engraved names. "They were heroes, Tommy. They died trying to do the right thing, trying to protect their fellow soldiers and serve their country with honor. The least we could do was make sure their families knew the truth about their sacrifice." A young woman approached the group wearing a Navy uniform with the insignia of a communications specialist. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Martinez, the one who exposed the conspiracy at FOB Valor?" Sarah turned, recognizing something familiar in the young woman's earnest expression and determined bearing. "I am. What's your name?" "Petty Officer 3rd Class Jennifer Morrison, ma'am. I'm Commander Morrison's niece." The young woman's voice carried the weight of family pride and personal mission. "I joined the Navy because of what my uncle did, and because of what you did to honor his sacrifice. I wanted to follow in his footsteps, to serve with the same integrity and courage he showed." Sarah felt a surge of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. The ripple effects of Morrison's courage were continuing to spread, inspiring new generations of service members who understood that true heroism sometimes meant standing up to authority and risking everything for the sake of truth. "Your uncle was one of the finest soldiers I ever knew. He trusted me with his most precious possession because he believed that truth was worth any sacrifice. I hope I proved worthy of that trust." Jennifer Morrison smiled, and for a moment Sarah could see the family resemblance, the same quiet determination, the same unwavering moral compass that had driven Morrison to investigate corruption even when he knew it might cost him his life. "You did more than prove worthy, ma'am. You showed that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that evil is inevitable or unstoppable." 10 years later, the Pentagon. Brigadier General Sarah Martinez stood in the office that had once belonged to Colonel Webb, now converted into the headquarters for the Military Integrity and Accountability Office, a new department created in response to the FOB Valor conspiracy and dedicated to preventing similar corruption from taking root within military institutions. Her promotion to general officer had been unprecedented for someone who'd started her career as an enlisted clerk, but her unique experience with institutional corruption and her academic expertise in military ethics had made her the obvious choice to lead efforts at systemic reform. On her desk sat a replica of Morrison's rifle, a gift from his family that served as a daily reminder of the price of truth and the importance of never forgetting the soldiers who died fighting corruption within their own ranks.
The original rifle remained with Morrison's family, but the replica carried the same symbolic weight, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are not fought against foreign enemies, but against the darkness that can flourish in any institution when good people choose silence over courage.
Chen, now a colonel, entered the office carrying a thick folder of reports from field commanders around the world. Sarah, we've got confirmation from 3 different commands that our new protocols are working. Early detection systems have identified and prevented 2 potential corruption schemes, and accountability measures have deterred several others before they could develop. Sarah accepted the reports with satisfaction, but without surprise. The institutional reforms they developed were based on hard-earned knowledge about how corruption spreads and how good people can be manipulated or intimidated into complicity. The key was creating systems that rewarded integrity and punished those who tried to exploit the trust and sacrifice of American service members. "Any word from Rodriguez?" Sarah asked. Chen smiled. "He's been promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to lead cybersecurity for the entire Pacific Command. Apparently, his experience exposing the FOB Valor conspiracy has made him something of a legend in electronic warfare circles." Sarah nodded, feeling pride in her former teammate's success. Rodriguez had used his skills and experience to build systems that protected military communications from infiltration and exploitation, ensuring that future conspiracies would face technological barriers that made the FOB Valor scheme impossible to replicate. 15 years later, home. Sarah Martinez, now retired from active duty, sat in her study working on the final chapters of her book about the FOB Valor conspiracy and its aftermath. The book was intended for military academies and professional development courses, designed to teach future officers about the importance of maintaining integrity and accountability within their organizations. Through her window, she could see her garden where she'd planted 47 trees, one for each soldier killed in the conspiracy. The trees had grown strong and tall over the years, their branches reaching toward the sky like prayers offered for the fallen. Her phone rang, interrupting her work. The caller ID showed Jessica Palmer's name, though Palmer was now the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post and one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. "Sarah, I wanted to let you know that we're running a major retrospective on the FOB Valor story for the 15-year anniversary. Would you be willing to do an interview about the long-term impact of your investigation?" Sarah considered the request, thinking about all the changes that had resulted from that terrifying night when she'd chosen to refuse Webb's convoy order and expose the truth about systematic murder within military ranks. "Of course, Jessica, but I want to make sure the focus remains on the soldiers who died trying to do the right thing. They're the real heroes of this story." Palmer's voice carried the warmth of long friendship and professional respect. "Always, Sarah. That's why your story matters, because it shows that ordinary people can choose to become extraordinary when they refuse to accept that evil is inevitable." After ending the call, Sarah returned to her writing, crafting sentences that would carry the lessons of FOB Valor to future generations of military leaders. The most important lesson, she'd concluded, wasn't about corruption or conspiracy. It was about the power of individual choice in the face of institutional pressure. Every day, in organizations around the world, people face moments when they must choose between personal safety and moral courage. The FOB Valor conspiracy had claimed 47 lives because too many people chose silence over resistance, compliance over confrontation. But it had ultimately been exposed and defeated because a few people, Morrison, Chen, Rodriguez, and herself, had chosen to risk everything rather than allow evil to flourish unchallenged.
The auditorium was packed with cadets, as Sarah, now a distinguished professor emeritus and recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, delivered her annual lecture on leadership and moral courage. At 72, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd earned the right to speak with authority about the costs and rewards of choosing principle over pragmatism. The question I'm most often asked, she told the young faces before her, is whether I regret the choices I made that night at FOB Valor, whether I wish I'd simply boarded that convoy and avoided the danger and responsibility that came with exposing the truth. The auditorium fell silent as 300 future officers waited for her answer. The answer is no, I don't regret those choices, but I do regret that they were necessary. I regret that 47 soldiers had to die before someone with access to the evidence chose to act on it. I regret that institutions designed to protect our nation's defenders had been corrupted to the point where good soldiers were murdered for trying to do their jobs with integrity. A cadet in the front row raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do we prevent something like the FOB Valor conspiracy from happening again?" Sarah smiled, recognizing the same earnest determination she'd once seen in her own mirror. You prevent it by understanding that corruption isn't a failure of systems, it's a failure of individuals to live up to their oaths and obligations. Every time you choose integrity over expedience, every time you speak up instead of staying silent, every time you refuse to be complicit in something you know is wrong, you're fighting the same battle we fought at FOB Valor. After the lecture, Sarah walked across the academy grounds, reflecting on the changes that had transformed military culture in the decades since the conspiracy's exposure. New accountability measures, enhanced oversight systems, and cultural reforms that rewarded moral courage had made systematic corruption far more difficult to sustain. But the most important change, she believed, was less tangible, a renewed understanding among military personnel that their oath to protect and defend included protecting each other from those who would exploit their trust and sacrifice. 25 years later, final entry. Sarah Martinez, now 87 and living quietly in a retirement community for veterans, opened her laptop one final time to complete the memoir she'd been writing for her grandchildren. Her hands, though aged and sometimes trembling, moved with practiced precision across the keyboard as she crafted the closing words of a story that had defined her life and legacy. I began my military career believing that I was just filing papers, processing documentation for other people's heroism and sacrifice, while remaining safely distant from the moral complexities of war and service. I ended my career understanding that there are no safe distances from moral complexity, and that every person with access to truth has a responsibility to act on that truth when action is required. The 47 soldiers who died in the FOB Valor conspiracy weren't killed by enemy bullets or roadside bombs. They were murdered by people who had forgotten that the uniform they wore represented something sacred, something worth preserving even at the cost of personal comfort or advancement. Commander Jake Morrison trusted me with his rifle because he understood that weapons are only as powerful as the courage of those who wield them. The real weapon against corruption and evil isn't technology or authority. It's the willingness of ordinary people to choose extraordinary courage when extraordinary courage is required. I was never a warrior in the traditional sense. I never led troops into battle or earned my medals through conventional heroism. But I learned that there are many kinds of battlefields, and that some of the most important battles are fought with documents and databases, with evidence and testimony, with the quiet courage of people who refuse to let evil flourish in darkness.
The choice to serve something larger than yourself isn't made once. It's made every day, in small moments and large crises, in the space between what is easy and what is right. Choose righteousness, choose courage, choose truth. And remember that 47 soldiers died as heroes, not because of how they fell, but because of why they stood up in the first place. Sarah saved the file and closed her laptop, feeling the weight of completion settle over her like a comfortable blanket. Through her window, she could see the flag flying over the retirement community's memorial garden, its stars and stripes moving gently in the afternoon breeze. Somewhere in Afghanistan, new soldiers were serving in bases that bore the names of the 47 heroes whose deaths had transformed military culture. FOB Morrison, Camp Martinez, Rodriguez Station, monuments to the truth that good people can overcome institutional evil when they choose courage over comfort. The war for truth never truly ends, Sarah knew. Each generation faces new challenges, new forms of corruption, new tests of moral courage. But the weapons remain the same: integrity, determination, and the willingness to risk everything for the sake of something greater than oneself. As the sun set over the memorial garden, Sarah Martinez, who had once been just filing papers until a SEAL commander gave her his personal M4 carbine, closed her eyes and felt the profound satisfaction of a mission completed, a trust honored, and a truth preserved for all who would come after. The 47 would never be forgotten. Their silence had become a song of courage that would echo through the ages. Subscribe to channel name where silence is never forgotten.